So after the Canadiens come away with a 2-1 shootout victory over the Toronto Maple Leafs, they come home and absolutely play putrid defense, losing 4-3 to the St. Louis Blues. Dobish plays back-to-back games, Montebo's out, and a lot's going on. Let's talk some puck. Hey gang, Costa here from PuckTalk Montreal for this December 7th, 2025 edition of the show, where the Montreal Canadiens come away from tonight's game with a 4-3 loss at the hands of the St. Louis Blues. And it's not like the St. Louis Blues dominated this hockey game. In fact, it was the Canadiens who dominated the majority of it. The problem? Defensive letdowns allowed the St. Louis Blues to score 4 goals. No fault of the goaltending, just absolutely putrid defensive coverage and a very bad bounce to start the game off. So let's take a look at the highlights, starting with the BRAINCRAMP goal that was scored at 8:57 on the power play. A shot from the blue line that takes a hop off a player in the slot, goes right to Schenn, open net, and he scores. Nothing Dobish could do on that goal. It's an unfortunate bounce, Schenn taking full advantage to make it 1-0 for the St. Louis Blues. Fast forward about 3.5 minutes later, where Lane Hudson scores on an absolutely perfect feed from Zach Bolduc as he dekes the living pants off Jordan Binnington. Here it is to make it 1-1. Good hands in tight by the defenseman to put it home and make it 1-1. That play, in fact, led to Jared Davidson's first career point. He got the second assist on that goal, so good on the young Habs forward. Then, just before the end of the period, who else but Cole Caulfield, who extends his scoring streak to 11 games at 6 goals and 5 assists, as he puts one home here on a nice feed from Nick Suzuki under Binnington's armpit to make it 2-1 for the Habs going into the first intermission. Everything looks great, right? Well, here's a lesson on how to lose a hockey game in 39 seconds, and it starts at the 26-second mark of the second period, when Dylan Holloway scores. And here's the thing, a bad line change by Montreal leads to this chance for Holloway, and he scores. Not only did Jane Struble come onto the ice late on the change, and I'm not going to blame him because obviously he's replacing whoever it is that came off the ice, but both Ivan Demidov and Alexander Teske especially missed their assignments and allowed Holloway to come in uncontested. So that made it 2-2. Okay, it's a tie hockey game. Oh, but wait. Just 39 seconds later, it was Pavel Buchnevich scoring his 5th of the season. And explain to me why Mike Matheson goes behind the net. I look at it again on the replay here. He goes behind the net and follows Thomas back there. Why? Completely losing who's behind him. Nobody in front of the net to cover, allowing Dobish all alone in front with Buchnevich. That makes it 3-2. Canadiens lose the lead, but after that point, they absolutely dominated the second period, despite the fact that they only outshot the St. Louis Blues by a 7-6 margin. But the play was tilted to one side, the Canadiens with possession of the puck for the majority of that second period. Then move on to the third period, where, once again, around the midway point of the period, it's Brayden Schenn on a 2-on-1, another play where Carrier steps up in the neutral zone for no reason to try to stop the player, and Schenn's all alone makes it 4-2. Now, here's the thing about that play. Carrier steps up in the neutral zone. First of all, it should have been called interference on Carrier to begin with, but the Canadiens never touched the puck, and I don't know whether or not the referee had his arm up. But the puck was behind Carrier when he stepped up and he tried to bump the player off the puck, the player being Joseph. Joseph, in turn, goes down on that same play and takes out the defenseman on that side of the ice. Who was it? I can't remember, but he ends up knocking him down, leading to the 2-on-1. So the fact that Carrier stepped up in the neutral zone is a big no-no. And it's another one of those defensive breakdowns that is a complete brain cramp for the Montreal Canadiens. There is no reason in the world that a defenseman should be stepping up on somebody in the neutral zone. I don't care what it is. Unless you're behind by 10 goals and you're trying to get back into a hockey game, of course, I'm exaggerating, but say you're down by 2. You need a little bit of offense. You want to spark a turnover in the neutral zone. Then step up. Try it. But in a 3-2 hockey game, no. And then, of course, late in the third period, Noah Dobson scores on a knuckle puck with the extra man on the ice. Straight off the draw, Demidov to Hudson, over to Dobson, who knuckles it into the top corner, making it 4-3. And that's all she wrote for the hockey game. The Canadiens with no more offense from that point on, and they come away with a 4-3 loss. So let's analyze this hockey game. Well, there's not much of an analysis to break down. Let's start with one thing and one thing only, and that is the shoddy defensive coverage once again by the Montreal Canadiens. They did well versus the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Leafs getting very little as far as offensive opportunities. Of course, they took away a little bit from their offense, but by and large, they played extremely well defensively. That limited the amount of opportunities Toronto had. So that's why you ended up with a 1-1 score through regulation and overtime. But then you move ahead to this hockey game where the defense was right out the window. Noah Dobson was pushing the play up the ice all night long. He was pinching into the offensive zone, which is something for a team that's having defensive struggles your defensemen should not be doing. Okay? There's only one guy on defense who should be allowed to do that, and that is Lane Hudson, period, at this point of the season, right? Until you get a control of your defensive liabilities, pinching is not an option. Again, unless you're behind by a goal or 2. But to start doing that early in the hockey game and just continue doing that leads to defensive breakdowns. Above and beyond that, the line changes and the neutral zone play needs to be a lot better for the Montreal Canadiens. When a defenseman changes, right, and gets off the ice, and another defenseman gets on, if the puck's going back to your end, you're not trying to stop somebody in the neutral zone of the defenseman. You're on your horse getting back, because chances are, by the time you turn around, that puck's by you. That's what happened to Struble on the Holloway goal. Above and beyond that, you also had Tetsier, who didn't recognize that Holloway was streaking up the middle of the ice. That was his man. He should have taken him. He did not. So again, for as much as criticism as people are giving Zach Bolduc, that was horrible on Tessier's part. And to boot, this was probably the best home game that Zach Bolduc has played all year long. He was visible everywhere on the ice, in his own zone, in the offensive zone. He was creating offense, getting an assist, of course, on the Lane Hudson goal, and he just continued to roll that way. So it was great to see. You could tell that he wanted to send a message to his old team like, you made a mistake letting me go. And that's what you want to see from players, right? For Texier's part, offensively, he was okay. Didn't really generate a lot as far as offensive chances, but he was okay. But defensively, still hasn't shown me anything as far as defensive coverage for a forward. So stop criticizing Bolduc. Let's stop saying he's on the fourth line because he's that bad defensively. How about we start looking at the guy who just joined the team who's that bad defensively? Anyway, getting away from all that. When you take a look at the other goal that was scored by Buchnevich, and why, when Dobson is already covering a guy behind the goal line, Matheson decides to follow Robert Thomas behind the net is beyond me. There's no reason to do that. As I mentioned in the show a couple of days ago, when you're playing man-to-man in the defensive zone, man-to-man below the hash marks is a three-man job. Both defensemen and the centerman are responsible for that job. So when the centerman's in the corner and your other defenseman, this time being Dobson, is in below the goal line as well, there's no reason for Matheson to go join the party. He should be in front of the net helping out his goaltender. No, he wasn't there. Instead, Buchnevich snuck in behind him while he was looking at the puck because, of course, he went behind the net, and Buchnevich was managed to beat Dobish in tight. None of the goals tonight, in my opinion anyway, had anything to do with something Jakub Dobish did. Okay? In fact, every single one of the goals tonight, there wasn't very much he could do because every goal was scored on the defensive laps. Would it have been nice to get a save? Absolutely. But they were all difficult saves to make regardless. It wasn't as if he let in a softie, right? He battled all night long, despite the fact that the Blues got only 18 shots on goal. He allowed 4, but he battled nonetheless. And so I'm not putting this on Dobish. And don't tell me I'm softer on Dobish than I am on Montembeault, because if this was Montembeault tonight, I would be saying the same thing. Unless he let in an absolutely putrid goal, this game's not on the goaltender. Kakkonen, who was the backup tonight, could have been in nets instead, and I still would have said the same thing. Because the quality of the shots that they scored on, one being a lucky bounce off one of our own defensemen to Shen, who had an open net. You had a couple of 2-on-1s, and you had a goal in tight from Rushnevich. How is that the goaltender's fault? It's not. Right? Simple as that. We could have gotten a save. If you would have made a save, maybe this game would have been a little bit different. But by and large, the quality of the shots that beat him was not in question here. So let's move away from the goaltending for a second, because that wasn't the problem tonight. Another problem, aside from the defensive coverage by the Montreal Canadiens, was the fact that once again, they hovered around 40% in the faceoff dot. They cannot allow themselves to be beat that badly at the faceoff dot and be productive offensively. Yes, they got 26 shots on goal. Yes, the majority of their shots did come from high danger areas in the slot. But at the end of it all, they didn't have possession of the puck, right? When you lose 40% of your faceoffs, you're not starting with the puck on your stick. That's a problem. While you can still come up the ice and still generate offense, which they did, when you start the majority of the game without the puck off faceoffs, you're starting on the wrong side of the puck. The Canadiens need to get better. They also did what I told them not to do. In yesterday's keys to victory, they needed to win the special teams battle. They did not. They went 0 for life on the power play, 0 for 2, and they allowed a power play goal to Braden Shen early in the hockey game. To me, that's a loss. Simple as that. Each team took 2 penalties in the hockey game. One of them scored on the power play. One of them didn't. Who wins? Well, St. Louis does. There's just so many things that went wrong for the Canadiens. St. Louis Blues with 5 takeaways. The Canadiens with just 2. Canadiens, 16 giveaways in this hockey game. There's a lot that went wrong. And so the Canadiens need to be a lot smarter when it comes to their defensive play and a lot more responsible. I don't have a problem with them, as I mentioned yesterday, playing defensively sound hockey so long as they take advantage on special teams or they dominated 5-on-5. They dominated at 5-on-5 today. Jordan Binnington was better on those opportunities than Jakub Dobish. The quality of the shots weren't quite as clean as the ones the Blues got to score on. So there's that. Yes, Binnington allowed a squeaker under his armpit from Cole Caulfield. Yes, he had got the pants deked off him by Lane Hudson. Yes, he allowed a knuckle puck to go in. What goalie wouldn't when the puck dips down into the net when it looks like it's going over? A lot of goalies do that. But the quality of those shots is nowhere near as good as the ones the Blues got. So the Canadiens need to trim this down defensively. Take a look at the video tomorrow. You don't have to be on the ice. Okay? You're playing Tuesday against the Tampa Bay Lightning. So, and you're coming off a back-to-back. You know the Canadiens are going to have an optional tomorrow or a therapy day or whatever it is. If there's something that they need to do, it's they need to sit down and have a video session with the players about defensively taking care of their zone. I showed it to you. If I can show it to you, a guy who's coached 20 plus years at the minor hockey level, the highest level being midget AA, well then maybe, just maybe, these guys at the NHL level should be able to recognize it and show their guys as well. It's just frustrating, right? And I'm sure you guys are frustrated too, because it comes down to the same mistakes over and over again. And like Einstein said, the definition of insanity is repeating the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Stepping up on a guy at center ice never turns out right for any team. It doesn't matter if it's the Habs or otherwise. 2 defensemen chasing players behind the net never turns out right for any team, even if it's not the Canadiens, because it's not the right way to play the game. You do not have 2 defensemen chase players below the goal line at once. I don't care if you're playing man-to-man or not. It's never an option. And as I mentioned, the danger zone, there has to be coverage in that danger zone. If there's no coverage, you release man-to-man, you get into the danger zone to make sure the man there is covered. That didn't happen. So those things need to be corrected by the Montreal Canadiens for them to have success. And as I mentioned, they're going into a very important game versus the division-leading Tampa Bay Lightning. The Canadiens could have been first in the division with a win. They screwed the pooch. A brain cramp, 39 seconds long, cost them the division lead at this point of the season. So we'll see whether or not they can take that lead from the Tampa Bay Lightning one-on-one when they face them on Tuesday. But we'll get there in tomorrow's preview show. Because it's Sunday, as you all know, it's time for us to do our studs and duds for the week of November 30th. So who are our studs and duds? Well, studs, it all begins with Cole Caulfield. He's in the midst of an 11-game point streak, scored in regulation and converted a shootout winner. His shootout opportunity versus the Toronto Maple Leafs. He scored again tonight. He scored versus the Winnipeg Jets. I mean, what more can you say about Cole Caulfield? Definitely been a stud over the last week. Jakub Dobeš, another guy who was a stud. So much so that he earned a back-to-back start. And now the Canadiens could have easily put in Kakko Kapanen to face the Blues tonight in order to give Dobeš a night off. But Dobeš earned another back-to-back start. Okay, and that speaks volumes towards the confidence that Marty St. Louis has in his goaltender. But at the same time, winning back-to-back shootout games, that goes a long way for a goaltender's confidence. So Dobeš, another one of my studs for the week. Juraj Slafkovsky, he continues to elevate. You know, he impresses me every game. You know, just the other day versus Toronto, he made a great defensive play with his stick. Did it again tonight. He's making great passes, good reads. He's good in his own zone. There's not a thing that I would say Slafkovsky is doing wrong. I'd like to see him score a few more points. I think we all would. But when you look at his game overall, there's nothing to complain about. And, of course, there's the continued play of Ivan Demidov. The fact that he's still producing points, although I would like him to shoot more. He's also getting more ice time, which is good, which we all clamored for. But, you know, he assisted on Caulfield's goal on December the 6th. He had 2 assists tonight. So there's a lot to be said about Demidov's game right now. Goals would be nice, but he's still collecting points. And so no complaints on my end from that perspective. So those are the studs. Who are the duds? Well, the duds for me, I'm not going to individualize it this week because it's way too broad a scope to be able to individualize it. I could say Mike Matheson, Noah Dobson for pinching too much, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Canadiens have been playing from behind a lot. So number one, to me, as far as duds are concerned, is the Canadiens' defensive coverage as a team. They look like putrid garbage versus the Colorado Avalanche, but we knew they were outclassed versus Colorado, right? But then versus Ottawa, they allowed 5 goals. And that should never happen versus against a team that is almost at the same place as you are vis-a-vis their talent pool, right? For just as much, although the goaltending in Ottawa is a little bit better, defensively, the Canadiens have more talent. They just don't show it. And offensively, the talent is pretty even. The issue is that the Ottawa Senators play a much better defensive game than Montreal does. So Montreal needs to tighten it up. They cannot continue to allow 4 or 5 goals per game and expect to win. As we mentioned, the formula for winning hockey games in the National Hockey League is 2 or less. 3 max, but 2 or less to guarantee victory, right? So you got to make sure you tighten it up defensively. Those defensive zone breakdowns, the Canadiens versus the Senators lost one-on-one battles all over the ice, especially in the defensive zone. You know, opponents, you saw it tonight, left unchallenged in the slot. Guys like Buchnevich, Holloway. That can't happen. So their defensive coverage needs to get a hell of a lot better, not just from their defensemen. I'm not pinning this only on them. The forwards need to be a hell of a lot more responsible in their own zone as well. They need to recognize what's happening in transition. They need to attack the right player and take somebody. Because, example, the Holloway goal. Texier coming back never gets to him, to Holloway, and never recognizes that Holloway blew right by him in the neutral zone because he didn't see the play develop. In order to be a good player at man-on-man, you need to recognize what's happening as far as the play that's coming onto you, and you need to pick a man immediately. You can't just wait. So if you're the first forward back or the second forward back, you should be able to pick somebody up. If Demidov has Holloway, then you can pick somebody else. If Demidov does not have Holloway, and he didn't, what you should do is pick that man up. That never happens. So whether it's hockey IQ or lack of communication, something's got to change there. And of course, the third thing that I found to be a little bit suspect, anyway, for me, was the lack of support for the goaltenders. Because there are too many chances being allowed from dangerous areas or off the rush that are causing fits for the goaltenders. Take, for example, what happened yesterday with Scott Lawton coming in on a breakaway and clapping a slap shot from 10 feet out. That doesn't happen if there's a little bit of support up the middle. Instead, nobody recognizes it. Dobson takes a bad angle, and away he goes. There are they're not huge adjustments the Canadiens need to make. They're small, right? When you're talking about an angle, you're talking instead of attacking at 90 degrees, attack at 45, you'll catch up to the guy because you'll have enough speed to be able to get there. Those type of things. You know, whether it's, as I mentioned, don't chase players behind the net, cut in front. Because if you cut, if Matheson on the Buchnevich goal would have cut in front, he would have seen Buchnevich coming and would have been able to stop and cover that man coming into towards the net. Instead, he went in behind, watched the puck, backed into the front of the net, allowing Buchnevich to get in behind him. It's little things like that that are causing big issues with the Montreal Canadiens defensive coverage. So the dud this week, by and large, is the Canadiens defense. The whole enchilada. They need to get better with their defensemen and allow them to be a lot more responsible as far as the man-to-man in their own zone. And the forwards need to come back and support those defensemen to make sure they mitigate those chances in tight. That's where everybody's scoring from Montreal these days. It's inside the hash marks, right? Below the hash marks, I should say, not inside the hash marks, from below, right? Whether it's at the net front, whether it's at the side, wherever. Shots from distance, we haven't seen a lot of them go in on Dobish, have we? That's because the chances are coming in from in tight. And Dobish has been good on those distance shots. So fix the defense. You'll be fine. And coming up this week for Montreal, next week in HabsNation, as we like to say, there's a lot going on. It's another one of those important weeks for the Montreal Canadiens coming up. And as I look at the schedule, as I mentioned, Tuesday, they take on the Tampa Bay Lightning at home before they hit the road for two. One versus Pittsburgh in Pittsburgh. And then Saturday and Sunday, again, they have back-to-backs. This time with the Rangers and back home at Madison Square Garden, and then back home versus the Edmonton Oilers. December is filled with games for the Montreal Canadiens. There's a total of 13 games in December before the Christmas break. So, you know, they're going to need to win some of the hockey games this month. They've won a couple, back-to-back shootout wins. That's fine. They lose tonight to St. Louis. This coming week, they've got to win at least 2 out of those 4 games, if not 3, to maintain their status in the Atlantic Division, right? A win versus Tampa, it's going to go a long way towards keeping that, staying close to the top of the division. Winning against Pittsburgh, it's feasible, right? Yes, Pittsburgh has Malkin, Crosby, Letang, you name it, but Pittsburgh is not also the team that they were just a few years ago. The New York Rangers, they're running hot and cold right now. So depending on what Rangers team you get at MSG, we'll see what happens. And then, of course, coming back home versus the high-powered offense of the Oilers, that's always a challenge for the Montreal Canadiens, although at home, they normally have better results versus Edmonton than they do at Rogers Center in Edmonton. So let's see how next week goes for Montreal. Personally, I think if they get 4 out of 8 points, we'll be in good shape. I would like to see 6 because that's possible. I know there's not a lot of practice. There's not a lot of time to be on the ice and work on different drills. But at this point in the season, right now, you're not looking at working on drills. You're looking at video work. You're looking at sitting down with your players and having a discussion with them. Not more than that. Communicate. Figure out where their heads are. Let them know what you expect as far as defensive coverages are concerned, where you see the mistakes happening, because the mistakes are rudimentary. In the neutral zone, those mistakes should never happen, so you clear that up with a simple video session. Okay? Defensively, those issues, you have your entire group together and you show them, boys, you need to recognize this play as it's happening. If the puck's along the far wall, somebody needs to be in the middle and keep an eye on the players streaking to the neutral zone, because those players can tend to be dangerous in tight if they're allowed to go unimpeded towards the net. So you need to have somebody covering those guys. It's simple. When I was coaching, I could do this on a whiteboard without using video, and I could explain it to players, and I let them ask me questions, and I respond, and I explain to them, right? In fact, I had an assistant coach by the name of Rock who used to call the slot the slut. Of course, he had a French accent, so everybody laughed at him, okay? But he didn't realize it. But at the end of the day, because he said it that way, the players remembered it. You think it's dumb, but it's little things like that that players remember, right? I remember it, and it happened 15 years ago. I've come across players that I've coached that same year with Rock, and they've mentioned it, and they still laugh about it 15 years later. So little things. Drill it into their heads. Make it a story. Make it simple. Let them ask questions about it. What you expect from them, explain, and let them ask what their responses are and what their thinking is. And find the middle ground. That's the most important part about defending. It's not about putting systems in place that work just for you as a coaching staff. It's about finding middle ground with your players so that everybody's on the same page. So if a player reads a play differently than the coach sees it, then maybe, just maybe, the coach can adapt to what the player sees so that he can make it easier for the player, given the fact that the player's so inclined to react a certain way. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's give or take whenever you're coaching, right? But for as much as players learn from coaches, the coaches learn just as much from players. And Marty St. Laurent will be the first one. Marty St. Louis will be the first one to admit that. So let's see what happens. We'll come back tomorrow with the show outlining and previewing this important game versus the Tampa Bay Lightning. We know that Montreal always has a hard time versus John Cooper. His teams are always well coached, but these aren't the same Tampa Bay Lightning as we've seen in the past. Yes, they still have Vasilevsky, but it's not the same team. So we'll preview that tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Go Habs, go.